It was an ordinary working day for Eli, a simple and dedicated man who spent most of his days looking after his farm. His hands were calloused from so much work and he always kept everything in order. However, that afternoon, while he was mentally reviewing the tasks he still had to finish before sunset, something unusual happened. A loud and unexpected noise, something he had only heard once in his life, caught his attention. It was the sound of a car followed by a bang so loud it made his heart race. Eli stopped what he was doing and looked around, searching for the source of the sound. His eyes quickly settled on a thin column of smoke rising over the horizon, coming from the direction of the orchard where he grew his precious manzan. The thought that something might have happened to his trees filled him with concern. Has someone hit my orchard? He thought as he hurried towards the incident, his heart in his mouth. When Eli got closer, the scene was frightening. A luxury car completely out of place on his simple farm was smashed against one of the manzan trees, and flames were already beginning to consume the vehicle. The heat from the flames was intense and the smell of burning gasoline filled the air. He tried not to get too close because of the fire, but his keen eye quickly noticed that the driver's seat was empty. The driver had disappeared. Momentary relief washed over him, but soon his mind returned to reality. Where was the person driving? Eli didn't have time to think too much. His protective instinct spoke louder and he began to look around. He needed to find the driver, whoever he was. Perhaps he was injured and needed help. Lost somewhere among the trees of the orchard, the fire was raging, and despite his fear of losing even more manas, he knew that saving a life was more important right now. With his heart racing, Eli began to search the area around the burning car. The heat was almost unbearable and he knew he had to act fast. The noise of the fire consuming the vehicle only increased his urgency, but as he paid closer attention he heard something different. A soft sound as if someone was dragging. His senses went on alert and he followed the noise, increasingly certain that he would find the driver. As he advanced between the trees, Eli noticed pieces of burnt clothing scattered on the ground, creating a strange and disturbing trail. Something inside him told him that the person he was looking for was not far away. With quick steps he continued until finally his eyes found what looked like a young woman with her back to him, trying to get up. She was unclothed, clearly vulnerable, with minor burns and signs that the accident had been serious. Without thinking twice, Eli took off his own shirt and put it over the young woman to cover her. He was stunned by what he saw. The girl didn't look a day over 20, and although she was unconscious, she was still breathing. The relief was immediate, but he knew he had to act fast. She was too weak to speak, trying to mumble something before collapsing completely in his arms. Eli looked at the flames behind him, considering what to do. The car could explode at any moment and there was no way he could put out the fire with the resources he had there. He made the only decision that made sense: to take the young woman in his arms and run back to his house. She was fragile, but he was a strong and determined man. He carried her to his bed where he carefully laid the girl down, checking for any serious injuries apart from a cut on her head which seemed to have been caused by the impact of the accident. She was miraculously fine. He then ran to the kitchen and with trembling hands called the fire department and paramedics, explaining what had happened. As he waited for rescue, Eli felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The fire had destroyed part of his orchard, but his priority now was to save that life. Even though he didn't know who the young woman was or where she came from, he knew that his role there was Crucial, she was alive and he had done his part. As Eli waited for the firefighters and paramedics to arrive, his gaze turned to the window where the fire continued to consume the car and, even worse, his beloved Manzanita Grove. He knew that the clock was ticking. The intense heat and flames were spreading fast, threatening not only the trees but all the hard work he had put into that land over the years. The thought made him anxious, but with the young woman unconscious in his bed, he knew he had made the right choice. Time seemed to drag on as he waited for help, and in the meantime what he feared most happened. The car exploded. The explosion was loud and powerful, and Eli could feel the impact on his body. Even though he was inside the house, he ran to the window and, with his heart squeezing, saw a devastating scene. The explosion had destroyed several of his trees, which were now nothing more than charred trunks and lost fruit. The sweet burnt smell of wood and apples filled the air, creating a bitter contrast for Eli. This wasn't just a field of apples, it was his life, his source of livelihood. Shortly afterwards, the fire department arrived and began to fight the flames efficiently. Eli watched with a lump in his throat as they tried to save what was left of his orchard. Unfortunately, much of it had already been consumed by the fire, and he knew that the destruction was great. The paramedics also arrived and quickly began tending to the young woman, checking her vital signs and treating the cut on her head. They were surprised that despite the severity of the accident, she was alive and with few serious injuries. As Eli watched the scene, his mind was divided. On the one hand, he felt the relief of having saved a life, but on the other, the pain of seeing the result of years of work reduced to ashes consumed him. He didn't consider himself a hero, let alone someone who accepted loss easily. "I don't want to be a hero," he said angrily to one of the paramedics who was praising him. "What I want is for that woman to wake up and pay for the damage she caused to my orchard." The words came out harsh, but he couldn't help it. All he could think about was the damage he would have to deal with after that fateful day. Even with the fire under control, the damage had already been done. The land he had cared for so much now looked like a battlefield. The look on Eli's face was one of frustration, and he knew that as well as dealing with rebuilding his orchard, he would have to deal with the mystery of the unknown young woman and the impact that accident would have on his life. From then on, after the paramedics took the young woman to hospital, Eli's life began to follow a new rhythm even heavier than before. His days, which were already tiring with farm chores, now included daily visits to the hospital. Even with the frustration of having lost part of his orchard, something inside him made him worry about the girl. Every afternoon after finishing his work, Eli would take his old truck and drive to the nearest hospital, which was miles from his home. When he got there, the scene was always the same. He would ask the nurses if the young woman who they discovered was called Lila had woken up yet, and every time the answer was a disappointing "not yet, Mr. Eli." Despite his tiredness and frustration, he made a point of seeing her. He would stand quietly by her bedside for about 15 minutes, watching the unconscious girl and wondering who she was and how she had ended up in such a serious accident. She seemed so fragile and at the same time so mysterious. The nurses noticed something curious. Over the days, there was always a bouquet of fresh flowers by Lila's bedside, and no one knew where they came from, but between whispers and glances they began to suspect that it was Eli himself who brought the flowers. Although he would never admit it, he never spoke much to them, but his presence was constant, and something in his demeanor, even if he was harsh, showed a concern that he tried to hide. As the days went by. The situation didn't change much. Poe remained in a coma and Eli continued his visits. He divided his time between work on the farm and trips to the hospital, but each time he left his frustration grew. It wasn't just the young woman who worried him. The smell of burning wood and fruit on his farm irritated him deeply, reminding him every day of the accident that had destroyed part of his life. What's more, he felt that something was unfinished, as if he needed answers. Who was that girl? Why was she so far away from the city, and how would it all end? Eli didn't like to leave things unfinished, and Lila's condition made him even more anxious for a conclusion. Finally, after weeks of uncertainty, the day Eli had been waiting for arrived. He was sitting as usual next to Lila's bed, watching her in silence, when he noticed something different. The young woman began to move slightly, her eyelids trembled, and suddenly her eyes slowly opened. Eli almost couldn't believe his eyes. His heart raced, and not knowing exactly what to do, he shouted for the nurses and called the doctors on duty. In a matter of seconds, the room was full of professionals who rushed to assess Lila. Eli, who had always been discreet in his visits, was practically pushed out of the room as the doctors urgently examined the young woman. He was impatient, pacing back and forth in the corridor, unable to stop thinking. Would she remember what had happened? Could she finally tell them who she was and what had led to the accident? After about 20 minutes, one of the doctors came out to talk to him. Eli, as we imagined, Lila is quite disoriented. She has no idea who she is or where she is, the doctor explained cautiously. The young woman had lost part of her memories, which included both her identity and the accident. She didn't know why she was there and constantly asked for her phone, believing that it would provide all the answers she needed. But Eli knew that her cell phone had been destroyed in the car fire. The doctor suggested that Lila stay in hospital for a few more days, but beyond that there wasn't much else they could do. He explained that due to the young woman's confused state and the lack of information about her family, it would be best for her to remain in Eli's care until something more concrete could be done. Perhaps you can help her recover, said the doctor. Eli was initially silent. The idea of having someone living in his house for longer didn't appeal to him. He was used to the solitude and silence of his life on the farm, but at the same time something inside him had changed during all those visits. Despite his initial resistance, he eventually sighed and somewhat reluctantly accepted the doctor's proposal. At that moment, Eli didn't know that his life was about to change in a way he would never have imagined. When Eli took Lila to his farm, things didn't get off to the best start. The young woman, still disoriented and unable to remember who she was, showed immediate discontent as soon as she set foot on the property. Accustomed to a different lifestyle, she was horrified by the simplicity of the house. Is this it? I'm staying here, she asked with a mixture of incredulity and frustration. Eli, who had expected a negative reaction, just shrugged, not having the patience to deal with her complaints. Soon Lila began to criticize everything around her. Don't you have internet? How can I live without internet? There's no decent television here, she complained, pacing back and forth in the small room. Eli, remaining as calm as ever, explained bluntly, here we live by hard work, girl, and if you want to stay here until you get your memory back, you're going to have to help me. Besides, you owe me for destroying my Mananita Grove, so you'll have to work to pay for the damage. Pa was stunned by the idea of working on the farm. It was clear that she wasn't used to that kind of life, and the thought of getting her hands dirty and helping out on the farm made her even more frustrated. However, she didn't have many options with her cell phone destroyed and no access to social media, which seemed to be all that mattered to her at the time. Lila had no choice but to accept the situation. For the first few days the routine was difficult for both of them. Eli tried to remain patient, but Lila's attitude, always complaining about the lack of comfort, was exhausting. On the other hand, the young woman with no memory and completely out of her comfort zone felt lost and irritable, but little by little something began to change. Lila, although she still complained, began to help with the small tasks: feeding the pigs, harvesting the carrots. Things that at first seemed impossible to her became part of her day. With each task completed, she felt a strange sense of relief, as if that simple job was giving her some kind of purpose. While she tried to remember who she really was, the days passed, and little by little Eli began to notice something strange about Lila. Even though she had no memory, there was something about her that indicated that her life before the accident was very different from the one she was living on the farm. She had an elegant posture, refined gestures, and her constant complaints about the lack of comfort suggested that she came from a place where luxury was commonplace. Eli, although curious, wasn't the type to ask too many questions. However, everything changed when an angry woman suddenly appeared on his property, accusing him of a terrible crime. It was an ordinary afternoon when the calm of the farm was interrupted by a car that stopped abruptly in front of Eli's house. Out stepped a well-dressed woman with an angry countenance. Without wasting any time, she started shouting, accusing Eli of having kidnapped her daughter. Confused and surprised, the farmer barely had time to process what was happening before the woman approached Lila and hugged her tightly, as if rescuing a lost treasure. "Are you crazy? How dare you kidnap my daughter?" the woman shouted, turning to Eli with hatred in her eyes. He, stunned, tried to explain that he didn't know who Lila was and that he had only rescued her after the accident, but the woman, who he soon discovered was Lila's mother, didn't want to hear any explanations. She firmly believed that Eli had kept her daughter locked up on the farm for all this time. For her, the farmer was responsible for Lila's disappearance. At this point, Lila, still confused, began to wonder about everything. She didn't remember her mother, but the way the woman treated her with such care and protection made her uneasy. "Who am I?" she asked, almost in a whisper. It was then that the truth came out. Lila was a rich and famous young woman, a well-known celebrity in the world of fashion and entertainment. Her life before the accident was full of luxury, events, and cameras, a far cry from the simplicity of Eli's farm. Lila's mother, in the midst of the accusations against Eli, revealed that her daughter had run away from home after an argument about her father, a delicate subject that always caused tension between them. Lila, desperate for answers about her past, had hired a detective to find out more about the man she had never met. It was this search that led her to run away, and she ended up suffering the terrible accident that left her with no memory. For Eli, the revelation came as a shock. He had saved a girl who was not only famous but whose life was full of secrets and family conflicts that he would never have imagined. After discovering that she was a rich and famous young woman, Lila became even more confused. She couldn't understand how a life so different from the one she was living on Eli's farm could be her reality. The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit together, and her mother's dominating presence only made matters worse. Every day Lila felt more and more as if something was missing, as if the truth was being kept from her. Her head was full of questions, and even though she couldn't remember the past, something in her heart told her that there was more to the story. Then her mother was willing to tell. It was then that Lila decided to act on her own. Suspicious of the way her mother was trying to control the situation, she got in touch with her former manager, someone who apparently knew a lot about her life before the accident. In a revealing conversation, he told her details that her mother had omitted. According to him, Lila had run away not only because of the stress of fame but because she was determined to find out who her father was. The detective she had hired was close to finding something important, and her mother, fearful of losing control over her daughter, was furious when she heard about the investigation. The truth slowly began to emerge. Lila had hired the detective to find out more about the man she believed to be her father, a man she knew almost nothing about but felt she needed to know. This explained her sudden escape and the accident that brought her to Eli's farm. Not only was she looking for answers about her own life but also about the past that her mother had hidden from her all these years. On hearing this story, Lila felt a mixture of anger and relief. Anger that her mother had lied and kept her in the dark about something so important, and relief that she was finally beginning to understand why she felt so lost. Her glamorous life full of events and fame wasn't enough to fill the emptiness she felt at not knowing who her father was. Now, with a clearer mind, Lila was determined to recover her memories and above all discover the truth about her origins. Lila's confusion turned into a new determination. She realized that she needed time to process all these revelations and understand her place in the world, and for that the strangest and most unlikely place, Eli's farm, began to seem like the only place where she could find the answers she was looking for. With the pieces of the puzzle finally starting to fit together, Lila made the most important decision of her life. She needed to talk to Eli. Something in her heart told her that he was the man she was looking for, the father she had never met. Her mother's resistance to letting her go ahead with the search only confirmed her suspicions, so without listening to her mother's constant objections, Lila decided to go to Eli farm to find out the truth. Eli, on the other hand, had already come to terms with the idea that he would never see Poe again. After learning who she really was, a rich and famous young woman, he had resigned himself to the idea that she would continue her life of luxury and never look back. The loss of his crop had been hard enough, but losing the chance to meet his own daughter even without knowing who she was an even harder blow. Nevertheless, he busied himself replanting the manzan, trying to get on with the simplicity of his life as he had always done. One morning while working early in the fields, Eli looked away and saw a familiar figure walking towards him. He blinked a few times thinking his eyes were deceiving him, but no, it was really Lila. She was there back at the farm, and she looked different. She wasn't the confused and disoriented girl he had rescued from the accident. There was determination in her gaze and a calm he hadn't seen before. "Hello, Eli," said Lila with a shy smile. "I'm really sorry about the way everything happened, but I needed to get back. I have so many questions and I think only you can help me find the answers." Eli stood still for a moment, absorbing the young woman's words. Time seemed to have frozen. He knew that something profound was about to happen, something that would change his life forever. His voice breaking, he replied, "What do you want to know, young lady?" Lila, her eyes full of emotion, finally said what she had been holding in her heart. "I want to get to know you better. I want to know if you're my father." The words fell like a stone on Eli's chest. He had lost so much over the years, and now the possibility of recovering the daughter he thought he had lost forever seemed surreal. With tears in his eyes, he took her by the hand and said, "Am I your father?" "More than that, daughter. Return. Do this together. We're going to plant the most beautiful manzanita grove you've ever seen, and with it rebuild what we've lost." At that moment Lila and Eli embraced, and the past full of doubt and hurt began to give way to a future full of promise and reconciliation. There in the field that had so often represented loss for Eli, he found something he hadn't known. He was looking for the chance to be a father again, to rebuild his family.